we're going to start with Louise, if that's all right.
Yep.
So Louise Bell, who's an independent researcher and is going to be giving us a talk on national diamond factories, a unique employment opportunity for disabled ex-servicemen.
Thank you. So, I'm going to give a bit of background to First World War disability and prosthetics before I dive into the diamond factory part of it, just to make sure we're all on the same page. So around 41,000 British servicemen returned from the First World War missing one or more limbs. This equated to around 11,600 cases of lost arms and 29,400 cases of lost legs. With hospitals opening solely with the task of helping these limbless men, it was important that workshops for the production of artificial limbs were set up in Britain in increasing numbers than there had been previously. Advances were made in the design of prostheses as well in procedures to do with fitting and repairing them. But once a man had his new limb fitted, he had to learn to use it. So the two ways that tended to rehabilitation strands were sport and employment. And one of the main ways that they could get used to a new limb and their new lives was through training in and gaining some form of new employment. So workshops and employment bureau were set up on the sites of some of the bigger hospitals, such as Erskine and Roehampton, with the task of letting these men see what employment opportunities were available for them and help them to gain employment. There were also initiatives set up, local and wider, for example, the King's National Roll Scheme, which was set up in 1919 as a means of attempting to gain more employment for more disabled ex-servicemen. This scheme essentially asked employers to sign up, and it was their choice to do so. This was not a mandatory scheme, and pledged to employ disabled ex-servicemen as 5% of their workforce. Many employers were encouraged by the advertising of the scheme as a means of helping those who had served their country, and employers could also display a crest and were given preferential consideration for government contracts. At the end of 1923, the Ministry of Labour reported that 28,051 firms were now enrolled in the King's National Roll Scheme. There is some evidence to show that companies were keen to employ these disabled men, as they've been trained to such a high standard in their respective trades. And during the war, there was no chance they were going to be called back up to the front lines. Now, new trades could be anything from woodwork and boot repairing to hairdressing and beekeeping. However, one of the most unique rehabilitation opportunities was that of working with diamonds. So the Brighton Diamond Factory was started in 1917. The buildings for this were built and equipped with money, which was mostly provided by Sir Bernard Oppenheimer, who was a South African-British diamond merchant and philanthropist. Essentially, the goal was to train men in diamond cutting and polishing and to bring Britain centre stage in this industry. So on the screen just now you can see the outside of two of the blocks that were part of the factory and the buildings attached to it. So disabled ex-servicemen were carefully selected and trained up in the factory. Selection was restricted to those who had lost a leg, and careful inquiries were made as to the past character of the candidates, which makes complete sense when you're working with such a precious commodity as diamonds. You can't have someone who doesn't have complete control of their hands, and you definitely don't want someone with a criminal past. The arrangement was that the government would pay maintenance allowances for periods of 6 to 9 months, and the company would pay the remaining costs, including the salaries for the instructors that they imported from Belgium and Holland. Diamond work wasn't something that had been sort of major industry found in Britain up until that point, so it makes sense that experts had to be brought in. Subsequently, smaller branch factories were set up in Wrexham, Cambridge and Fort William. Now, a quick aside just while we're looking at the images of the factory just now. And one report notes that the rooms in which the men were working were well lit and warm, which would have helped create a safe, comfortable environment for them. You see similar decorating requirements in the force for men who are also suffering from shell shock. Now, by the beginning of 1919, Oppenheimer believed that the scheme was working satisfactorily enough for him to want to extend the premises in Brighton. The main difficulty with this arose around accommodation for the trainees and employees. Up until that point, men were housed in single-room accommodation. However, the majority of them were married, and having come from all over the country, they naturally wanted their wives and families to be in Brighton too. As a result, the local authority began making plans for a housing scheme for these men, while many prominent people in the area began to offer help in finding accommodation for the workers. Hostels were also provided to accommodate men, and eventually difficulty was overcome and the extension of the factory was possible. By the start of 1919, around 500 men had been thoroughly trained in diamond cutting and polishing. Now, interestingly, and probably unsurprisingly, the men were not allowed near diamonds initially. Instead, they did all their practicing on marbles, as in the marbles that you play games with, not marble, the actual material. And they had to wait until they were proficient enough to not make any mistakes, and then they were allowed to work on diamonds. And on the slide just now, you can see a man, and he is cutting diamonds in this. Now, the company wanted to make it very clear that this was not a charity, and that they were training these men up so that they would be able to have a career in the industry. They were also being paid as they progressed through the training and then being employed by the factory. Initially, a typical weekly maintenance allowance was £2 a week, and this included their pension money. At the end of the 6 to 9 months of training, the man would resume his pension and gain a minimum wage of £2 for a working week of 45 hours. After this, the money that the man earned depended on himself, and his weekly wages would advance with the progress that he made in the factory. So those who had been in the factory for at least a year were earning on average £2.15 a week. And after 2 years, it is estimated that they should be able to earn from £4 to £6 a week. Again, all of this was based around the proficiency and the productive capacity of the men. Now, the factory was one of the biggest in the Brighton area, and some pretty big names visited to see the work that was being undertaken there, including Field Marshal Douglas Haig and John Galsworthy. Some of you might know Galsworthy for his literary works, but he was also a big advocate in the campaigning for rights for disabled ex-servicemen. Now, in 1921, there was a sharp slump in the diamond industry, which I guess is unsurprising, you've just come out of a war. Oppenheimer died early in 1922, after which the remaining directors decided to close the 3 branch factories and reduce the running costs in Brighton. As a result, around 2/3 of all the men who had been working for the company were discharged. They were offered alternative courses of training instead. During the following year, the company struggled to carry on with business and eventually closed at the end of 1922. And just while this image is on the screen, just say that this image shows men sitting polishing diamonds, and the stools that they're sitting on were adapted to make it more comfortable for them with their new artificial limbs. Now, rehabilitation and employment for disabled ex-servicemen after the First World War is an area in which some research has already been undertaken. But I think the diamond factory at Brighton is an institution that won't be as well known. It also serves to highlight the variety of trades that were available to these men despite the fact that they were missing limbs. Now, this has been a work in progress for the last 2 years of my life. I started work on it when I was working at the National Archives, and I haven't really had much time to do anything on it so far since then. I briefly mentioned it in conference papers, and it's always something that piques people's interests, and I find it such a fascinating area. As I say, never seem to have the time to go back and properly do the research. So I'm hoping that actually talk about it today will give me some ideas and actually give me the push that I need to actually just do some work on it. Obviously, there won't be much going ahead in terms of archival research the next wee while, with the archives still being closed. But if anyone has any suggestions of places that I could look for more references on this, I know that there's a lot more at the National Archives that I could look at. I'm all ears, and I'm also interested to know what people would like to know about this research, maybe try and give me a steer of what I should do and give me a sort of further focus when I actually look at it. And that's me done. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks very much, Louise. So I think that we will carry on then and go to Lucy, and then we'll have the 10 minutes after that.
Okay, Thanks, Louise. It's great that our papers actually have such shared interests. So I'm going to talk today about my research. Let me just bring up the pictures for you all. It's my research about a project that I've initiated on learning disability. I've titled the talk Labouring Lives of Disabled People because I'm thinking of extending it from learning disabilities or intellectual disabilities into a wider range of disabilities. So I'd be interested to hear what people think about that. But I'm going to talk today about the research on people with learning disabilities because that's the work that I've done so far. And I'll just warn you all that I may be using terminology from the historic period, which we would find stigmatizing and offensive today, but I'm using it to give a flavor of the kind of debates of the past. So it's a project which is broadly framed around the short 20th century. It starts in 1913, which is the launch of the Mental Deficiency Acts, which saw large-scale efforts to institutionalize people with learning disabilities. And it ends in 1980 with a period of quite sharp recession and economic restructuring that saw the economy move to a more credentialized economy. It saw the rise of computers. It saw a number of factors that made it harder for people with learning disabilities to get by in the labour market. Numbers of people with intellectual disabilities or learning disabilities are pretty hard to establish. It was estimated by some commentators in 1931 that it might be about 10% of the population. So there were some really enormous estimates of the numbers we're talking about. But variously across the 20th century, it was often estimated to be about 1 million people or something more than that. Today, it's estimated to be about 1.1 million people in Britain. But you know, the edges of how we define intellectual disabilities are very, very vague. So this is a substantial group, but not one that we can really pin down. So my project is about trying to change the focus of the historiography away from asylums and institutions, which are a very well-established part of the story. And rather to look at the numbers of people who were not institutionalized. And I'll just show you on this chart, if my thing will allow me to move. Yes, there we go. You can see here, these are figures taken from the mid-20th century, and they just give you a sense in the navy blue of the overall numbers of people thought to have learning disabilities. And then the orange column are the people who are actually institutionalized. And you can see that for all these data points, the numbers who are living in the community, which are the two center columns, are substantially larger than the numbers who are institutionalized. So most people with learning disabilities who were known to the authorities were living in communities. And that means that they shaped their lives. And for the 20th century, the short 20th century, large numbers of them were working, actually much larger numbers than we see today, although there are problems with trying to equate the two periods. So I would like to see them as low paid workers rather than as patients. And that leads me to look at a number of different kinds of sources. I had hoped that it would mean that I could go to employers and trace their records and try and find employment records. But really, I discovered at the outset of this project, employers did not categorize their workers by disability for the main part. There's a few exceptions to that. But there really aren't the archival records that I had hoped for. So I wanted to decenter the state and go to employers and decenter kind of, the kind of carceral story, if you like. But that wasn't really possible. So the sources that I'm going to show you, these will just be like snapshots of the sorts of things I'm working on, mostly are state generated. So you can see here, for example, this is from the wonderful digitized collection of Trade Board exemption certificates held at the Modern Records Centre. And it's about people who are applying to get exemptions from minimum wage legislation on the basis of disability. And you can see here that this is describing a female worker in the tailoring trade who is described as delicate, small, too unintelligent to be employed as a learner. And these just give wonderful snapshots of individuals, normally not named, so there are limits to what we know about these people. And these cover the early to mid 20th century. Here's another example of the kind of records we have. These are the aftercare records of special schools in the London County Council area. And there are quite detailed records kept of the kinds of jobs that people took after having been through special schools. And I should note, although a large proportion of people at special schools had learning disabilities, not all did. So this is difficult data. We would have to read it carefully around the assumptions we can make about people's abilities here. But you get some nice details of wages, of the kinds of trades that are represented, and you get some little notes in the final margin. You've got there, for example, one worker who was sacked because of smoking in the lavatory, which gives us the kind of nice flavour of working lives. Here's another source, and this is a rare one, where we have the individual who themselves have been defined as having as being feeble-minded in this case, or having learning disabilities, writing letters, and these are letters written to the Ministry of Pensions contesting the non-payment of pension. And this individual, you can see he wrote by hand, but he also typed a bit later in the century, and gave some very interesting and full accounts of his working life. So this is a very rare moment of voice. From a bit later in the century, this is the Ministry of Labour, and the Ministry of Labour has been an absolute, gold mine for me. There's all sorts in there, and I think that people who've looked at disabilities in the past have often tended to look at like Ministry of Health type sources and have neglected Ministry of Labour. So this is a great National Archives find, and you can see here this is a industrial resettlement unit report on a worker who was described as dull and backward. And just a last source here, this is from the Ministry of Labour's survey of employment exchanges around the country, asking what do you do about people with mental handicap or mental deficiencies? And again, you get some really interesting kind of pen portraits of workers. So in the last few minutes, I want to, I'll stop sharing now and just bring out what I'm hoping the contributions might be of this project, but also some of the problems. I can just see a question there, the 1915 application. It was in the Modern Records Centre, just responding to that comment there on the chat, where they have a brilliant set of digitised exemption certificates from the minimum wage trades boards across different trades, the so-called sweated labour legislation. Okay, so contributions. What I'd really like to do is try and map out and understand better how sheltered, semi-sheltered and open labour markets interacted. So there's a lot of movement across those different types of labour markets, from people who sometimes might have been institutionalised at some point in their working lives, but sometimes then went out under statutory supervision or worked with a voluntary sector project, and sometimes moved to the open labour market. And there are some very interesting kind of sectors which are pretty hard to fit into those categories, such as the category of industrial therapy. What was industrial therapy? Was this about well-being? Was it about work? Should we read it as an exploitation of labour? Sometimes I think it definitely was, but some very interesting categories there. I want to probe at the idea of modern management and try to understand and problematize the idea of paternalism on the part of employers. There's a lot of discussion about, good employers and their efforts to employ disabled people. Sometimes they may have existed, but I've also been able to trace some quite significant ways in which employers were profiting from labour, and the labour of disabled people was not always dignified with wages. So sometimes they were offered treats or what were called incentive payments. So there's definitely a narrative there about how capitalism extracts labour, and I want this project to be about a kind of a political economy of disability, if you like. I think there's really interesting race, ethnicity and class dimensions to be drawn out. I can talk about that. I want to get away from a kind of a Whiggish narrative, if you like, of confinement in the asylum and then community care, meaning sort of liberation. I want to tell a story that's not framed around those events. And finally, policy relevance. I want to encourage policymakers today to aim a bit higher when they think about the possibilities for employment of people with disabilities. Shockingly, they aim at kind of very, very low targets for this. On problems, the sources are quite problematic, as you might have been able to tell from that little glimpse. They're very, very eclectic. How do we deal with the fact that people with learning disabilities today can't really be mapped onto people who were termed dull or backward or feeble-minded in the past? I think it raises real conceptual difficulties there. And finally, I think there are wider questions in disability history about how we think about categories like autonomy and agency in relation to people with learning disabilities who may not easily fit into our sort of conventional understandings of what exerting agency might be like. And there's been some fantastic kind of critical queer theory on this, this concept from people like Lauren Ballant. So I'm interested in bringing that to bear on historical sources and really working with ideas of agency to figure out what that can mean in this area. So I will leave it there. Thank you all.
Great, thanks very much, Lucy. And Tali, who is a PhD student at the Department of History at the University of York. And she'll be talking about inside the outsize problem, clothing diverse consumer citizens under rationing. So over to you, Tali.
Hello. So in 1941, after nearly 2 years of war and with a declining position of supplies, the British government introduced clothes rationing so that everyone may have their fair share. But how fair was this scheme exactly? Although all citizens presumably received the same ration, large groups with special needs received appropriate supplements. So industrial workers, for instance, who were about 30% of the population, were granted 10 additional coupons. But some minority groups did not fare as well. Men and women who were larger than average sizes, commonly called outsizes, were one such group. From 1942 and until the abolition of clothes rationing in 1949, ready-made outsizes were in constant shortage, leaving about 4 million people, or 12% of the adult population, inadequately clothed. So this paper will examine the reasons that this overlooked problem emerged and make some preliminary comments about why it remained unsolved for so long. The origin of these shortages was in the planning of the rationing scheme. The ability of the Board of Trade to enforce this scheme depended on yardage as a constant, unchanging characteristic across the supply chain. So each square yard of woolen material was worth 3 coupons, and garments were pointed in accordance with the yardage of fabric that they used. When they assigned coupon value to different garments, the civil servants at the Board of Trade calculated the amount of fabric that a garment would require. A woolen dress was 11 coupons, a fully lined overcoat was 18. It is easy to imagine that different garments require different quantities of fabric. A skirt obviously requires less fabric than a dress. But dresses of different sizes also require varying amounts of cloth. So to keep rationing simple and fair, citizens' body measurements did not affect the number of coupons they had to give in exchange for an article of clothing. But if all dresses required 11 coupons to buy and not all dresses required 11 coupons to make, then this meant that yardage was no longer a constant, unchanging characteristic. So the Board of Trade's Statistics Department tried to solve this problem. They studied it, and they based coupon pointing on what they considered to be the average use of cloth for the garment. They were certain that this way, small garments, small sizes would save enough fabric to compensate for the additional fabric that larger sizes required. But there was no research at the time about the distribution of girth measurements in the population, so they based their assessments on height distributions, which I'm going to show you are quite different. So these graphs these graphs display data collected in 1943 by the Board of Trade when they wanted to assess the portion of the population that was hit by outsized shortages. So as you can see at the bottom here, height distributions are quite normal, and they're symmetric around the average. This is the average line. Girth distributions, however, in these two top graphs demonstrate a skewed pattern. So in these, the tail on the large end of the scale is longer than the tail on the small end of the scale. This shape of the distribution meant that while citizens of smaller sizes were more numerous, their measurements were quite close to the average size. And although they were fewer, the measurements of citizens who were outsizes spanned over a wider scale. So this gap between the use of fabric for smaller sizes and cloth requirements for larger sizes was exacerbated by the limitations of fabric cutting. In 1941, shortly after the introduction of the rationing scheme, the Wholesale Fashion Trade Association advised the Board of Trade that smaller sizes could not compensate for larger sizes owing to a waste in cutting small sizes. So not only did outsizes require more fabric, even in the most efficient section of the clothing trade, smaller sizes did not save enough cloth to compensate for them. This made the manufacture of outsize ranges disadvantageous for the clothing industry. So the Board of Trade tried to solve this by introducing various concessions between August 1941 and March 1949. Yet this problem persisted, leading many citizens to write to the board and to their MPs and to various newspapers complaining of their inability to find clothes that fit them. One outraged consumer exclaimed that the cynical disregard of one section of the community by the government and the clothing manufacturers is not in line with service or democracy. And another consumer called this situation maddening. So why did the government fail to solve this issue once shortages and their underlying reasons were evident? Board of Trade internal correspondence demonstrates that this was the result of a mixture of sizist prejudices and conflicting interests between various departments. So at the public-facing department, civil servants were concerned about the amount of correspondence that this problem generated. So they offered assistance only to those in dire need by giving supplementary coupons. But they were also unwilling to advertise this concession for fear that applications would flood their busy offices. They saw an advantage to making a manufacturing concession, but the manufacturing department was uncooperative. They thought that if manufacturers were not complaining about this problem, then it doesn't exist. However, evidence shows that once manufacturers realized that they were able to get by without producing outsizes, they stopped pressing this issue. Moreover, across the Board of Trade, civil servants were more willing to believe that consumers were lazy than to admit that there was a genuine shortage of supplies. Needless to say that laziness was commonly associated with outsized consumers. So unlike larger populations, individuals who wore outsized garments were not a large unified group that could challenge sizist prejudices and lobby for an appropriate concession. The shortage of outsized garments affected a large enough number of consumers to be in continuous debate at the Board of Trade. But being only about 12% of the adult population, it was not significant enough to merit a clearly defined solution that would eliminate that would eliminate this problem, like we've seen with industrial workers. As a minority, these 4 million individuals did not get their fair share of clothing. The lack of data about the distribution of body measurements in the population and yeah, it meant that the Board of Trade was not able to assess this problem at its onset. But the problem remains of why the board did not alleviate these shortages later on. So the main issues here were representation and solidarity. The outsized population had no representative body to push for a comprehensive solution like the trade unions could do for industrial workers. But it was not only their size that put this group at a disadvantage. Far smaller minority groups like the Jewish community and vegetarians and diabetics received appropriate concessions for food rationing, for instance. So I would like to suggest that besides their minority status, this group also suffered from a lack of unity. Being outsized was not central enough to these citizens' identity to make them into a cohesive group. In the absence of solidarity, they had no real power against government complacency. And it is only recently, with growing consumer demand and growing pressure from plus-size groups, that we even begin to see any real change in this sector. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Zehra. So Zehra is a PhD student at Birkbeck, and will be talking to us about researching Turkish-speaking Londoners working with oral histories. So over to you.
Hi, thank you. I'm going to share my screen. I have some slides, but they're just illustrative really, and they're mostly of my own family story because I haven't actually started my oral histories yet. So these are musings about what might occur and problems that I foresee occurring. Sorry, just trying to set it up. Oh. I'm failing, sorry. Okay, I think we're good. Sorry, I appear to be having, there we are. So my research is concerned with the lived experience of Turkish-speaking Londoners, defined as those who came as immigrants from Turkey or Cyprus, and all who claim to be Turkish, Turkish Cypriot, or Turkish Kurdish heritage between 1960 and 99, and how these experiences have changed over time. Britain's immigration story has, to date, focused heavily on Black and Asian migrants from the Commonwealth. Debate and scholarship, therefore, has been focused heavily around race and colour until the 1980s, when a shift towards religion as a paradigm through which to research immigration emerged. Much fantastic work has been accomplished around the Jewish community and the Muslim community, of which the Turkish-speaking migrants are one. The Turkish-speaking diaspora doesn't fit comfortably, though, within either of these narratives, often white-presenting and treated as such, but often very much treated as the other. Historical scholarship focusing on Turkish-British Muslims usually focuses on, British Muslims usually focuses on the South Asian community and mentions the predominantly Muslim Turkish-speaking population of Britain only in passing. The numerous and highly useful sociological and ethnographic work that does exist is often concerned with identifying trends, talking about demography, and challenges of integration. I'm interested in those things too. My research would be infinitely more difficult without this previous work. Fundamentally, though, I would like to create a body of material with my participants that allows more room for a life stories narrative than has hitherto been possible, a narrative that might inform and aid scholarship beyond this project and encompass groups within the community that have been less well represented in previous studies, for example, the world of women. Oral history is a rich and rewarding method of approaching this topic. The underrepresentation of women in studies to date is due, in part, to research being carried out in the 1970s and 1980s in the workplace, such as factories and restaurants, where there simply were fewer women. Women did, of course, work in the factories, but certainly until the 1990s, a far larger number worked as machinists from home, whereby the work was delivered and picked up, enabling them to work, but also fulfill their domestic role. Further work has been carried out by male researchers, which has made access to women without another man present difficult according to the cultural norms of the times. Tali talks extensively about this problem in his 1999 work. Therefore, we often hear about women's working lives and other lived experiences through the voices of the men in their lives. Whilst using oral history as a method for telling women's stories is quite well developed, this has not yet sufficiently infiltrated scholarship around Turkish speakers in London or other more invisible minorities, I guess. Historical research in the rest of Europe is more abundant, particularly regarding Turkish-speaking Germans, and is often far-reaching in scope. This lacuna means that certain subjects, such as domestic violence, sex, honour, and motherhood, have not yet been sufficiently explored in the context of Turkish-speaking women. Literacy levels amongst women who first came to London in the 1960s and 1970s can also be quite limited in some cases, which makes oral history an effective alternative to more traditional methodologies. Aside from the usual considerations when working with oral testimony, fallible memory, creative memory, bias, and representativeness, there are two considerations that I'm currently grappling with that I would like to talk about today. The first is sampling, and the second is the role of the researcher as an insider or an outsider. In considering how to source participants, the obvious avenue is to contact community associations, mosques, supplementary schools, and anywhere else where one might expect Turkish-speaking Londoners to congregate or seek advice. However, if we consider the oldest members of the community for a moment, there are cultural norms associated with interactions with older people in the community that require attention. Respectful, hierarchical relationships are key to meaningful interactions in Turkish society, even in Britain. It is hard, though, to form these trusting relationships in a short period of time with people with whom you may have no existing relationship with, for example, simply by advertising in a mosque. In fact, other oral historians have found that they often receive no responses at all to such advertisements. Louise circumvented this problem with her Chinese participants by eschewing the usual community associations and newspaper advertisements, and instead reached out to her family and friends for interviews, but crucially also for introductions to others. Further, she utilised the traditional Chinese mechanisms for building relationships, such as bringing gifts of fruit to the interview. Hospitality and gift-giving also represent part of the Turkish experience of bonding. Lee is not alone in this. David Palmer required the help of community leaders to reach his Ethiopian refugee participants and actively attended the Ethiopian church in London in order to build meaningful bonds with those who would become his interviewees. Norton Wheeler needed an interpreter and a go-between in China. And Susan Barton used her Japanese friends to help her source interviewees for her project, and crucially, took along Kate. My project is no different. During the PhD interview, I was asked how I would source participants, and it felt at the time that the correct answer was, I'm going to use schools, mosques, and community centres. I do hope to engage with these institutions because they will be able to help me with participation and background research, I hope. But I fundamentally want to source my participants by starting with a family of 3 women in Tottenham, a grandmother, a daughter, and a granddaughter. I do know this family. The matriarch was a close friend of my own grandmother, though my interactions are far more limited in adulthood. Twice a year, this family's home becomes inundated with guests on Eid, or Bayram, as Turkish speakers would say. They represent the linchpin of a segment of the community, and when I occasionally make it along, I not only get an incredible full Turkish breakfast, but also meet people that I may have met once or twice in my childhood, and am able to reform relationships. This strikes me as a good place to start, at least with regard to female participants. I have an existing relationship. I know culturally how to navigate this relationship, the forms of address that are appropriate, and in starting with this family, I have the advantage of being able to interview 3 generations of the same family to consider continuity and change over time. In turn, I will have access to their wider network to whom they can recommend me, which will be crucial for trust purposes. In short, it will provide a solution to the problems around relationships and trust, and I hope allow me to probe deeper and elicit these women's feelings around a range of issues that have not been explored in detail, if at all. When it comes to male participants, my starting point is my own father. This is actually my grandfather. I grappled with this for a while. It is, after all, his stories as an immigrant worker, first in his father's restaurant here in Dalston, and later in the rag trade as a Hoffman presser, who spent a decent proportion of his leisure time in the kahvehane, the cafes that Turkish men often socialised in. It will be incomplete to leave him out, but I do need to be careful. Not only that, but he has a whole network of people that he can open up to me. I'm not a totally objective and dispassionate historian, but I do strive to acknowledge my place in the narrative and to check and to question my emotions and motivations, which I hope mitigates allowing myself to be so close to my subject. I take heart, though, that others are working with material that relates to their own story too. To pick out just 3, Alison Light has written on her own family history to speak to wider historical topics. Gayut Bahadur explicitly did so in Coolie Woman, And Panikos Panay has just this year published his new book, Migrant City, in which he is clear about the place of his own experience and presence in amongst the deep archival research that went into the project. I can only strive to do the same. Of course, the very concept of oral history and this project hangs somewhat in the balance given the current pandemic and the inability to have face-to-face encounters. Michael Roper and Betty Joseph have pointed out that interviews are not just about the words that are spoken. Mood, emotion, and direction of travel. It's all gauged, refined, and moved forward by relationship and interaction, and often the silences and that which is not said. Conducting interviews remotely is of course possible with today's technology, but I cannot help but think that this project will look very different if this is a path that I have to take. At a guess, I would anticipate less participants who came as adults in the 1960s and 1970s, which will be a grave loss to the project, and potentially deprive it of an intergenerational perspective. Not to mention that in this particular case, where rapport is likely to be so important, it will be significantly harder to build that and maintain it. This brings me to my second consideration, my place as an insider and as an outsider. So far, researchers have fallen into a number of categories. There is the insider from Turkey. Researchers in this category, mostly carrying out their work in the 1990s, encountered hostility as potential participants worried that they may have been acting as spies for the Turkish government. There's the Turkish-speaking Londoner insider. Researchers in this category have been first-generation immigrants and often heavily involved with the community. They have been able to use their research to great effect to address inequalities such as educational attainment. But due to them often being male, have encountered the lack of women's input that we've already come across. The outsider. Scholars here are not of Turkish-speaking descent and therefore mistrusted too. Potential interviewees wonder why they are interested in their lives at all. If they came to Britain as refugees, they may worry that this person is seeking to catch them out in some way. The outsider might also have a language barrier, which has its own problems. I would consider myself as both an insider and an outsider, which may produce other problems. In particular, if I am able to sample in the way that I proposed, then there is the possibility that some of the interviewees will feel too close to me, and therefore may not share honestly and openly. But as the snowball effect takes shape, the relationships will be diluted, and I anticipate that this will become less problematic. Being an insider might also lead to increased worries about gossip within a close-knit community. That anything that they say may be repeated to others that I'm interviewing. The only way to mitigate this is by doing my best to encourage them to trust me and presenting the professional nature of my work, and perhaps using my slightly outsider persona. I only have one Turkish parent and did not grow up directly within the community, interacting only through my paternal grandparents' network. Other concerns might be mitigated by suggesting anonymity as far as it is possible within any written work and the use of pseudonyms, and obviously reaching wider with my sample outside of the core group discussed above, which I envisage as a starting point. I'm only at the beginning of this process, and perhaps my thoughts and experience will change as I move into the fieldwork stage. Perhaps the sampling will be harder, perhaps it will be easier. Likely, it is not for me to decide if I'm an insider or an outsider, but the way that my participants interact with me will probably be the proof of the pudding, really. Thank you.